night of September 26, 1918, was dark and cloudy on the Bristol Channel. Swells occasionally broke over the bows of an Allied convoy as they patrolled for German U-boats. Despite the moderately heavy seas, the darkness ushered in a sense of calm, as it would be hard to spot the ships without any light. Still, lookouts scanned the horizon, searching for any signs of the enemy, as the silhouettes of the other ships passed noiselessly across the inky darkness. But then, at 8:15 p.m., the sound of a distant explosion echoed in the darkness. About 2 minutes later, another louder blast rocked the quiet night. On the convoy's flagship, a radio operator noticed the jolt of an underwater explosion. Then, the night fell silent once again. It would be hours before these men realized that the sounds they heard that night signaled the greatest American naval combat loss of life in World War I, as 131 lives were snuffed out in less than 3 minutes. In 1790, the newly independent United States had a problem. The Continental Congress, which governed the 13 colonies during the Revolutionary War, lacked the authority to levy taxes. In order to pay for the costly war, the Congress relied on printing money, which led to hyperinflation and foreign loans, mainly from France and other European powers. The new country badly needed revenue to shore up its currency, pay off debts, and run the newly formed federal government. Wary of directly taxing a population that had just gone through a long and costly war, it was decided that the best way to raise funds would be through tariffs on imported goods. Americans would still pay, of course, but they would do so by paying higher prices on the foreign goods they relied on. But a new problem quickly arose. After the war, the United States disbanded its navy, as there was no peacetime military threat, and the government simply couldn't afford to maintain it. Without any naval body to enforce tariffs, a large network of smugglers soon flourished. At the urging of the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the United States established the Revenue Marine on August 4, 1790. The legislation required the commissioning of 10 vessels, which would form a system of cutters. These modest 35 to 55-ton vessels would be tasked with armed customs enforcement at the country's coasts, from New Hampshire to Georgia. Much of the activities of these early revenue cutters has been lost, as most logs and documents regarding the service were destroyed during the War of 1812 and in a fire at the Department of the Treasury in 1833. But Hamilton's letters give us a good idea of the types of duties these ships carried out. They included boarding incoming vessels and checking for proper paperwork, ensuring cargo was properly documented, sealing cargo holds, and seizing vessels that violated the law. In addition to tariff enforcement, the service would also enforce quarantine restrictions, chart local coastlines, enforce neutrality and embargo acts, carry supplies to lighthouse stations when needed, and occasionally carry officials. These enforcement efforts paid off. Over the course of the 1790s, the United States was able to pay off most of its foreign debts and steady its financial position. By the 1800s, the new country's financial reputation was so strong that it was able to secure low-cost loans to finance the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The Revenue Marine didn't remain the country's sole naval force for long. The rise of piracy quickly outpaced what revenue cutters were able to protect. In response, the Naval Act of 1794 re-established a standing navy consisting of 6 frigates that began operations in October 1797. While not designed for combat, revenue cutters played a role in nearly every naval conflict that occurred during the service's over 100 years of existence. During the War of 1812, the Revenue Marine was temporarily moved from the Treasury to the Navy to aid in the war effort. Generally, the war was a disaster for the United States, but the revenue cutters saw some limited success. USRC Jefferson was the first American ship to capture a British ship during the war, but several cutters were eventually captured by the British. On June 13, 1813, the 16-member crew of the USRC Surveyor put up a valiant fight to defend their ship, even resorting to hand-to-hand combat. The cutter was eventually captured, but only after the British suffered 7 wounded and 3 dead. Only 4 Americans were injured. Another cutter, the Eagle, was forced to beach during a British attack. Refusing to surrender, the revenue men dragged the ship's cannons up a nearby bluff and continued firing until they ran out of cannonballs. Even then, they resorted to firing back cannonballs that had been shot at them by the British, using pages from the ship's logbook as wadding. But eventually, the British were able to capture the Eagle. After the war, the Revenue Marine returned to its custom enforcement duties, but the rise of piracy continued, and revenue cutters occasionally found themselves in skirmishes with pirate ships. In 1832, Secretary of the Treasury Louis McLean issued an order for revenue cutters to begin operating winter patrols in order to offer assistance for mariners in need. These were the first life-saving missions that would eventually become core to the cutters' missions. Once again, the Revenue Marine took part in the Mexican-American War and played a key role during the Civil War. On April 11, 1861, USRC Harriet Lane fired a warning shot across the bow of a civilian mail ship that failed to identify itself as it entered the Charleston harbor. It was the first maritime shot fired during the war. The Revenue Marine would go on to play a key role in enforcing the naval blockade on the Confederacy. After the war, the Revenue Marine saw significant reforms. A study to review cutter design as the fleet adapted to the steam age saw several changes. The purchase of Alaska in 1867 greatly expanded the service's jurisdiction. At the same time, public pressure was mounting on the federal government to improve safety and life-saving services after a series of high-profile sinkings. In July 1894, the Revenue Marine was renamed the United States Revenue Cutter Service. By the turn of the century, the U.S. fleet of revenue cutters had evolved substantially, taking on a number of new duties that went well beyond customs enforcement as life-saving missions were becoming more common. But the fleet was aging. A recommendation was made that in order to remain efficient and keep pace with the rapidly evolving shipping industry, the service had to produce 2 new cutters a year. These new cutters would be capable and resilient, designed to face the growing challenges of a rapidly changing world. On April 21, 1910, 2 new cutters were authorized. Labeled number 22 and 23, the 2 new ships were nearly identical. Their designs closely followed plans for the Tahoma and the Yamakra, launched in 1908 and 1909. They would each displace 1,181 tons and measure 190 feet or 58 meters in length, with a beam of 32.5 feet or 9.9 meters, and a draft of 14.1 feet or 4.3 meters. The 2 new ships would be named Miami and Onondaga. They were initially to be built at the Norfolk Navy Yard, but the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company eventually won the bid. A contract was signed on May 26, 1911 for a cutter that would be completed within a year at the cost of $250,000. The newly created 8-hour law guaranteed workers an 8-hour workday. Construction was supervised from Washington by Captain William C. Reynolds. Captain Richard O. Crisp would supervise on site, sending weekly reports to Washington on the cutter's progress. The custom of captains closely collaborating during construction had been in place since the earliest days of the Revenue Marine. Captain Crisp would serve as Onondaga's first commanding officer, and he would command the Tahoma when she sank in the Aleutians, only narrowly escaping with his life. He would later become the official historian of the Coast Guard. Miami and Onalga were scheduled to launch on January 27, 1912, but ice delayed the launch until February 10th. The two cutters were launched almost simultaneously. Miami hit the water first, followed by the Onalga just 20 minutes later. It was just the third double-ship launch in the shipyard's history. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries from the Treasury Department, the Revenue Cutter Service, the Army, Navy, and Congress. Miami was christened by Miss Mary Barnes Richardson, daughter of Representative William Richardson of Alabama. Over the next few months, the Miami was fitted out. By April 12th, she was ready for her sea trials. Captain Crisp was delighted with her performance as she sailed the waters off the coast of Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay. Her brand new triple expansion steam engine power plant produced 1,300 horsepower, and the cutter achieved a top speed of 13 knots, well within her desired specifications. Her trials were completed on April 27th, and she was officially accepted by the Revenue Service on May 8th. Miami would replace the cutter Forward, built in 1882. Her captain Aaron L. Gamble and crew transferred directly to the Miami. It was a considerable upgrade from the 30-year-old 267-ton brigantine steamer, which was decommissioned on August 19, 1912. That same day, Miami was officially commissioned. Her first station of duty was Key West, Florida. From the outset, she was a happy ship and quickly formed close ties with the city of Tampa, Florida, where she was based during the hurricane season. Most any sailor would have felt lucky to be assigned on the cutter, and there was no reason to believe that she had anything but a bright and peaceful future ahead of her. The Miami was still being prepared for her sea trials when on April 15, 1912, the Titanic sank on the North Atlantic. The shocking disaster had a profound impact on shipping. Safety moved from just a consideration to a priority. In addition to the numerous changes in safety regulations, the issue of ice became a major concern. Titanic was far from the first ship lost to ice, but the disaster showed that even modern and well-equipped ships could be vulnerable, especially as speeds continued to increase. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was created to monitor icebergs on the North Atlantic. While funding was shared across 13 nations involved in transatlantic sea travel, the United States was invited to manage the service. Immediately after the loss of the Titanic, the Navy was initially tasked with ice monitoring duty, but the responsibility was quickly transferred to the Revenue Cutter Service due to the agency's experience dealing with ice in Alaska and the Bering Sea. A new purpose-built vessel was briefly considered, but the idea was ultimately rejected. Instead, two existing cutters would be tasked with patrolling for ice: the cutters Seneca and Miami. From February to May, the two ships would serve alternating 15-day shifts, patrolling sea lanes and reporting ice locations to government hydrographic offices in New York at 4 each morning. Official wireless alerts were sent out twice a day to all ships on the Atlantic, sharing the information gathered by the cutters. The service would prove to be immensely valuable. No ships collided with icebergs during the first years of the International Ice Patrol. When Miami wasn't operating out of New York or Halifax for the Ice Patrol, she served other duties on the eastern seaboard, enforcing shipping and navigation laws. During the hurricane season, she would operate out of Tampa, Florida, and quickly developed a close association with the city. Starting in 1913, her crew became a beloved fixture of the annual Gasparilla Carnival, and won awards for their infantry formation in the carnival's parade. By all accounts, whether she patrolled for ice or hurricanes, the Miami was a happy ship. This continued throughout her short career, even as change loomed on the horizon. When war broke out in Europe, ice patrols were suspended, and Miami remained closer to home as the United States maintained its neutrality. In January 1915, the Revenue Cutter Service and the United States Life-Saving Service were combined to form the United States Coast Guard. The service was relatively small, consisting of less than 4,000 men by the time the US entered World War I. This number would grow to 6,500 by the end of the war. On February 1, 1916, Miami was renamed Tampa to honor the ship's friendship with the city. Life on board followed a familiar routine, but an air of uncertainty hung over the cutter as Europe was consumed by war. Many believed that it would only be a matter of time before the United States entered the conflict. While the Coast Guard was new, it was clear that the service's revenue cutters would play a key wartime role, just as their predecessors had for more than a century. Tampa and her crew took part in their final Gasparilla Carnival in February 1917. You could have imagined that she would soon leave the city that she had grown so close to for the last time. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America's entry into World War I followed years of tension as the officially neutral country balanced public opinion, which strongly favored isolation, with the elite's allegiances to the Allied powers and the profits of a potential war. Eventually, Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which saw the sinking of the Lusitania and many other ships carrying American citizens, and the release of the Zimmermann telegram, a coded message sent from Germany to Mexico promising former Mexican territories in exchange for allegiance, anti-German sentiment in the United States finally reached a breaking point. It was to be, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, a war to end all wars. For the Tampa, war preparations had already begun. Only a few weeks before war was declared on March 22nd, the Coast Guard was sent confidential orders to operate as part of the Navy when required. Cutters were assigned to naval districts and required to report their positions. Tampa was initially considered an independent cruising vessel and reported directly to headquarters in Washington. Repairs, fuel, oil, and supplies were all handled by the Navy, while the Coast Guard remained in charge of personnel. Tampa would retain her captain, Charles Satterlee, who joined the cutter in December 1915. Satterlee was born to a prominent Connecticut family. After joining the Revenue Cutter Service in 1895, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his actions during the Spanish-American War. He had plans to retire from the Coast Guard at the end of a 3-year tour of duty with the Tampa and take over his family's large farming business. In December 1918, he would likely hand over command to someone else, but for now he was tasked with preparing the cutter for war. When the United States entered the war, while some foreign-born Coast Guardmen opted to stay with the cutter and obtain their citizenship, others left to their home countries. Wartime duties required a larger complement, and recruits soon came pouring in. The Coast Guard was an appealing assignment, and many volunteered for the service just to avoid being drafted into the Army. Many signed on for 1 year. For many, this was extended to the duration of the war. Some draftees got the lucky draw and were assigned to the Coast Guard outright. Others simply signed up, looking for an adventure at sea. They came from all over the country, some even from countries like Norway and Russia. But a number of them came from right home in Florida, living not far from the city that the cutter was named for. They were farmers, laborers, students. Most were very young, only just out of school. Some even younger than that, having added a few years to their enlistment papers. Their time with Tampa promised to be brief, a year at least, maybe more depending on how much longer the war dragged on. There was good reason for the recruits to believe they would never even sail anywhere near the conflict. But in July 1917, the Tampa was one of 6 long-distance cruising cutters selected for convoy duty in the North Atlantic, right in the heart of the war zone. Her large coal bunkers and generous water tanks gave her the range required for the assignment. Her white hull was painted slate gray, and she practiced evasive maneuvers under the command of the 7th Naval District off the coast of Florida while she awaited deployment. Orders finally came on July 6, 1917. She left Florida for the last time and sailed for Brooklyn, New York, where she would be refitted for convoy duty. Unnecessary equipment was removed to make space for a larger wartime complement. Larger guns were added, as were additional depth charges, which was hoped to make her a U-boat killer. New charts were ordered, as well as new flags for the European nations that she would soon frequent. Navy publications and codebooks were also supplied. By September 15th, the work was completed. After 2 days of sea trials and a few days of shore leave, Tampa sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia, before heading in a zigzag pattern for the Azores, arriving on October 14th. Finally, on October 26th, she arrived in Gibraltar, where she would report for duty, quickly being assigned to escort duty for a convoy bound for England. For the first time in her short career, the Tampa would face a formidable enemy, hidden beneath the waves, desperate for a chance to change the tide of a long and bitter war. While the U-boat was probably Germany's greatest weapon of World War I, by the time Tampa arrived in the waters off Europe, the Allies had finally managed to defend against the catastrophic losses they caused during the early years of the war. In May 1917, the British Admiralty introduced the convoy system on the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea. The system proved highly effective, reducing Allied losses considerably by 1918. Ships like the Tampa were key to this success. While far from the most formidable of warships, Coast Guard cutters served as danger zone escorts, protecting merchant convoys as they passed through the U-boat-infested waters between port and the open sea. Ships capable of confronting U-boats were in short supply, and often there would be as little as one protecting a convoy of 6 to 30 vessels. Eagle-eyed lookouts were trained to spot the telltale signs of a periscope breaching the waves, or the unmistakable trail of a torpedo. When a U-boat was spotted, cutters would set general quarters, increase to full speed, and race in the direction of the enemy to give gun crews a chance to fire, sending the submersible fleeing, or maybe even scoring a kill. Tampa was based out of Gibraltar, and joined Seneca, her former ice patrol companion, Yamacraw, Ossipee, Algonquin, and Manning, making up Squadron 3 of Division 6 of the Atlantic Fleet Patrol Forces. Convoy duty wasn't easy. Escorts often struggled to keep the ships together. Speed was reduced to the slowest in the convoy, and during the winter months, ships were battered by ferocious storms. Long winter nights carried the constant risk of collisions as ships sailed through the darkness in total blackout. On the night of November 21st, 1917, a lookout on the Tampa noticed lights in the water. They soon realized that 2 merchant ships in their convoy, the Bilbster and the Malbin, had collided in the darkness. Tampa took on 36 men from the Bilbster before rejoining the convoy. Only a few days later, on November 24th, a U-boat was spotted stalking the convoy. Tampa sprang into action, firing 21 rounds of ammunition, but the German submarine managed to escape. It was one of many close calls for the cutter. The day after Christmas 1917, in the waters off Plymouth, Tampa's convoy was thrown into chaos when torpedoes hit the Bonito and the Trigena in quick succession, sending both merchant ships to the bottom. These moments of action were brief. Convoy duty was mostly a game of hurry up and wait. Several days or even weeks would pass without any run-ins with the enemy at all. Voyages could be deceptively calm, though crews remained ever vigilant, knowing that the hidden enemy could strike at any moment. The ultimate goal was to score a kill. But most days passed without any excitement. When not on escort duties, the sailors enjoyed time ashore, taking part in baseball games, swimming, biking, hiking, and exploring Gibraltar, Plymouth, and Pembroke. For many of the men who had seldom traveled far from home, the experience was a great adventure. Many quickly made friendships and grew ties with locals and the crews of other ships. After 6 months, the men were given free trips on the British Railway. In July 1918, Captain Satterley took the opportunity to visit his family's ancestral home, Sauderley House in northwest England, and had lunch with the current owner, Mrs. Violet Barn. It was a cherished experience that he wrote of fondly in his final letter to his wife. By September 1918, Tampa was going on a year of wartime duty. The cutter and her crew were given a special commendation for their exceptional wartime service, high morale, and crew capabilities. She was always a happy ship, and her record showed it. On September 17th, she left for another routine convoy escort. By the 26th, the cutter was running low on coal. Captain Satterley requested permission to detach from the convoy, but it was deemed too risky to sail through U-boat-infested waters on her own in broad daylight. Tampa would have to wait. Finally, at 4 p.m., the request was made again. This time, permission was granted, and Tampa peeled away at 4:15, bound for Milford Haven, Wales. She set off alone at full speed with her lights turned off, soon disappearing over the darkening horizon. As the sun began to set, a sense of safety set in, but danger lurked, only just below the waves. SMUB-91 was a German Type UB-3 submarine, commissioned on April 11, 1918. The U-boat was the most powerful tool at the disposal of the German Imperial Navy, and for years the fleet of undersea killers seriously threatened Great Britain and her allies. But by the time UB-91 touched the water for the first time, the tide had turned as the German war machine began to unravel. Still, U-boats stalked the waters of the North Atlantic, hoping to peel off as many Allied merchant ships as possible in order to starve Great Britain and give the German Empire a chance to reverse the course of the war once again. On the night of September 26, 1918, UB-91 was patrolling the waters just outside the Bristol Channel when its silhouette appeared on the horizon. Her commander, Wolf-Hans Hertwig, soon realized that they had spotted an Allied warship sailing alone in the gathering darkness. He quickly lined up his submarine, and at 8:15, they fired a single torpedo. It slammed into Tampa's hull amidship, setting off a huge explosion. Only moments later, a second, much larger explosion ripped through the night, set off by either her coal dust or her munitions. In just 3 minutes, the burning cutter slipped beneath the waves. Ten minutes after firing the torpedo, UB-91 surfaced to search for survivors, but they found nothing in the darkness. No trace of the cutter or the men on board. It was as if they had never even existed. UB-91 soon fled the area. She would sink 2 more ships in the coming days, including the Japanese transport ship Hirana Maru, killing 291 passengers and crew. She would surrender to the British at Harwich on November 21st, 1918. While many heard the explosion that sealed the Tampa's fate, no one realized that the cutter had been lost until she failed to arrive in port. Over the next 3 days, seaplanes searched the area, eventually finding an 8-square-mile debris field, which was soon found to be from the Tampa. Only a single body was found floating in the wreckage. 2 other bodies were eventually found on the beach in Pembroke several weeks later. Only 3 bodies were ever found. The explosion and the sinking were so catastrophic that no one on board had time to escape. There were 131 men on the Tampa when she was lost, including 111 Coast Guard men, 4 Navy men, and 16 British Navy men and dock workers. It was the largest American loss of life in naval combat during the war. Due to its relatively small size, tragedies like the Tampa are why the Coast Guard suffered a higher percentage of casualties than any other branch of the American military in World War I. It was a devastating loss that reverberated throughout the service, as well as through the local communities that had become a second home for the men of the Tampa. For family and friends back in the United States, the pain was immeasurable. Many spent decades honoring their lost loved ones and lobbying for recognition of their sacrifice. Finally, on November 11th, 1999, the Tampa's crew were posthumously awarded the Purple Heart in a ceremony held at the Coast Guard Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. By the 21st century, the Tampa was just a distant memory. But then, in 2023, a group of British volunteer technical divers called the Paratus contacted the US Coast Guard and expressed their desire to locate the long-lost wreck. The Coast Guard Historian's Office shared details of the Tampa's final location, and the team spent the next 3 years methodically searching. Finally, in April 2026, the wreck was found approximately 50 miles off the coast of Cornwall, 320 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a somber victory as they revealed the final resting place of those men, whose lives were ripped away in the blink of an eye. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.